Welcome to Trust Talk. Our guest today is Nicole Gillespie. She is the KPMG Chair in Organizational Trust and Professor of Management at the Australian University of Queensland Business School and an International Research Fellow at the Centre for Corporate Reputation at Oxford University. During our conversation, we explore a wide range of trust-related aspects. We cover the challenges that academics encounter when translating their trust research into practical solutions for businesses and shed light on the evolving landscape of academic publications, discussing the shift from content-focused approaches to the emphasis on rankings and commercialization. We also discuss the fascinating realm of trust repair, comparing the intricacies of trust restoration at both interpersonal and organizational levels. Throughout our discussion, Nicole highlights the pivotal role vulnerability plays in building and rebuilding trust. Cultural differences in working relationships come into focus as we navigate the dynamics of trust across diverse backgrounds. Lastly, we touch upon Nicole's 2020 publication on AI and trust, where she unpacks the importance of identifying 6 dimensions to ensure trustworthy artificial intelligence. And finally, we hear about the challenges that young researchers in the realm of trust face today. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Nicole, awesome to have you here on the Trust Talk podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Severin.
We bumped into each other briefly at the FINT conference in Helsinki not too long ago. FINT, by the way, stands for First International Network on Trust. It's this gathering where senior and junior researchers from various fields and different countries get together to brainstorm and explore fresh ideas about trust. And we met there. My first question, Nicole. I noticed that many academics at the FINT conference faced challenges when it came to translating their research findings into real-world solutions. In your opinion, what are the key barriers or difficulties, if you like, that academics encounter in bridging the gap between theoretical research on trust and practical applications in business settings?
Yeah, it's a good question, Severin. And look, some journals and reviewers focus almost myopically on how research contributes to theory, and they tend to value that sometimes over research that's targeted at solving really important practical problems and challenges. And I think a balance is needed here. I mean, theory is important. There's the old adage that nothing's as practical as a good theory, and we do need to advance theory. But what I find is, particularly in the trust research, is that sometimes we become stuck in applying really worn out and outdated theories just for the sake of having a theory, even when they don't really bring insight. So I think part of the solution here is interdisciplinary research, where we're breaking out of our disciplinary silos and addressing the more critical trust issues. So I think starting with what are the real big issues and trying to actually tackle those. And I think part of doing that is listening to industry, listening to government, reading the papers, really understanding, well, what are the critical issues that are being faced at the moment? For example, we've got a Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance. It's a group of very active researchers who are working in this space. And we have an industry advisory board from across all different sectors. And we come together regularly to hear what are the key trust ethics and governance challenges that are keeping you up at night. Tell us about those. I think also partnering and co-creating research with, again, industry, governments, non-government organisations, that can really help to make sure we're focusing on the right questions, we're using the right methodologies. And industry can be really fantastic at helping to translate the research that we do in a way that's accessible and meaningful in practice. I think also encouraging and valuing academics who target journals that are aimed at a more of a practitioner audience, not just academics. There are a lot of journals that do a really good job at wanting to be based on rigorous research, but want it to be presented in a way that is accessible. And I think I'm really encouraged because many journals are moving towards this. For example, the Journal of Trust Research, which is associated with FINT, they're encouraging practice papers. We're actually launching a whole section of the journal where we're wanting people to write papers in a really practical way, but based on the rigorous research.
Let's stick with the scientific community. During an earlier interview for this podcast with Robert Lepenies, the youngest university president in Europe, we explored the transformation of publications from a tool for sharing research insights and scientific processes to a system that emphasizes ranking individuals and institutions, commercialization and prioritizing impact over content. What are your thoughts on this?
In my experience, there is a pretty wide variation in universities and how they operate and approach this. I do think that there are some universities that really value good quality publications and really think about the content and the quality of what they're doing. And I think there are many journals that continue to focus on wanting to share the good research insights that really do have that relevance to important problems in society and business. But I do agree that there has been some worrying trends in some universities where they're so focused on the ranking or the prestige of the journal that rather than thinking about the contribution the research is making, they really put too much emphasis on that. At the same time, what I have also seen is a strong trend in many universities to really elevate the importance of research impact. So what I mean by that is research that really is designed to solve really big, challenging problems and really contribute to the practice of that. And I think that's a really healthy and welcome development. And I am seeing increasingly, at least at my university, more and more academics, including young academics, really pivoting their research to make sure that it's much more relevant, much more practical, much more useful. And again, that has been tied up in a shift towards more interdisciplinary work, working together in large interdisciplinary teams on big grants that are trying to solve really big issues. I think the other aspect of this is where I'm probably see the most worrying trend is some universities, particularly I think the US business schools, they sometimes have very restrictive journal lists. They really train their people, only publish in these 6, 7 or 8 journals. Anything out of those journals we don't really consider. And they even train their academics not even to read more broadly than those journals. And I find that really problematic because social science, we need to be cumulative. We need to build on the knowledge base of what we had before. So if we're not looking broadly across what's been published, then that can be problematic. We can be ignoring some really, really good work.
In your 2018 article you wrote with Sabine Siebert, Organizational Trust Repair, you mentioned that most studies on trust repair have focused on interpersonal relationships rather than organizational or institutional trust repair. What are some of the key differences between trust repair at the interpersonal level and trust repair at the organizational level?
Yeah, it's a good question, Severin, and there are a lot of important differences. In general, I would say that restoring trust in organisations is typically more difficult than repairing trust in interpersonal relationships. It's not always the case, but typically it holds. And why is that? Well, after an organisational trust violation, there's a really complex and diverse set of stakeholders that the organisation needs to repair trust with. And those stakeholders often have different interests, expectations, different vulnerabilities, and they also often perceive and make sense of the violation in different ways. So, for example, think about vulnerable customers who have been affected by a data breach. Now, they're likely to see the situation differently to, say, shareholders of that organisation who may have an interest in maximising their returns. So different stakeholder vulnerabilities can lead to different expectations of what they want the organisation to do to repair trust. And organisational trust repair can also be more difficult because it's often unclear in the immediate aftermath of some sort of a violation or scandal who or what is responsible for the violation. Often that requires investigation. Often it involves third parties, sometimes independent investigations. Often legal processes become embroiled in this. So lawyers are in, the media's in the mix as well. So just consider, for example, BP after their oil spill. It took, a long time, months if not years, to investigate and really figure out responsibility there. So it's a lot easier to go through that sense-making process of what happened, why, who's responsible in an interpersonal relationship. I'd also just add here that the attributions of responsibility after an organisational trust violation can also be shaped by group dynamics and identities and heavily influenced by social media. For example, research shows that victims often interpret transgressions by an organisation as something that the organisation has done and is responsible for. So the bad barrel is the organisation, whereas the transgressing organisation often see the violation as the fault of just a few bad apples, so some deviant members. An example of this could be police violence towards minority groups or people of colour. We often see those communities that are affected as seeing this as deep-seated racism, and it can trigger social movements against police, whereas it's not uncommon for the police and those within to view this as an isolated problematic behaviour or poor decision of a few officers. So these different assessments can really make it hard to repair trust, and responses that might restore trust with external stakeholders might actually undermine trust with internal stakeholders. And that indeed is something we've shown in case studies. So really this sense-making aspect of trust violations is much more difficult in the context of an organisational trust repair situation. Now, in saying that, some repair principles are the same. So, for example, typically after a trust violation, there's a need for social rituals and symbolic acts that help resolve the negative emotions that are caused by the violation and help to reestablish, if you like, the social order in the relationship. And this is where apologies, paying penance, accepting punishment, offering some kind of amends or compensation, these can work at an interpersonal level as well as an organisational level. Now, in saying that, organisations do have ways to repair trust that aren't always available to an individual. For example, organisations can fire the people who were responsible for the violation, and it's not uncommon for us to see heads rolling after some sort of major trust violation. The whole senior management team might be removed and a new leadership team brought in. So these are just some of the many different ways that the dynamics can vary between the two.
In your article, Measuring Trust in Working Relationships, the Behavioral Trust Inventory, you discuss the central role of vulnerability in trust and how it can be both essential and interestingly intertwined with the level of trust in a relationship. Could you elaborate on the concept of vulnerability in trust and how it can be experienced differently based on the level of trust?
It's such a good question, Severin, and you might have noticed at the FINT conference there was a lot of focus on vulnerability, and I'm really pleased about this because vulnerability is really at the heart of the definition of trust. We often define trust as the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another based on positive expectations of the intentions or behaviour of that party. So when we trust another, we are willing to make ourselves vulnerable to them and their actions. How do we show this? Well, we rely on them. We might share sensitive information with them. These are ways that we willingly make ourselves vulnerable in our interactions with others. And we know that trust is most relevant under conditions of risk and uncertainty. So when things are totally predictable or under our control, we don't really need to trust. Now, the paradox here is that when we have high trust in someone, we often don't feel subjectively vulnerable in the relationship. We have very strong positive expectations of them. We believe they're going to be benevolent towards us. But yet, objectively, in a material sense, we usually do make ourselves most vulnerable to those we trust the most. So that's the paradox that we talk about in trust. And we actually recently completed a review of the literature on vulnerability, so not on trust, but looking at vulnerability as a central concept. And this literature is really fragmented, but from that we were able to identify a definition of vulnerability, which so our working definition is that vulnerability is a state of being exposed or susceptible to potential harm, loss, or adversity. And one of the real insights that I took away from doing that review was that vulnerability is just inherent to being human, and it's inherent to organizations. We're all fundamentally vulnerable. And yet what we see, particularly in management and organizational science research, is that we tend to focus on the dark side of vulnerability. So seeing vulnerability as something that's bad, something that needs to be avoided or mitigated or eliminated. Yet there's actually a really bright side to vulnerability as well. Not only is vulnerability central to the whole notion of trusting others, but it also helps us to connect with people that can be very different to us, can facilitate innovation and learning. It can help us to be more resilient. And vulnerability can even trigger compassion. It can trigger us to want to help others, to want to seek help, give help, and for us to want to protect others who are in a vulnerable situation. So there is a real bright side to vulnerability as well.
In the same article, you mentioned that risk and interdependence are two other important factors for trust. Can you explain how risk and interdependence play a role in establishing trust, especially in relationships between individuals?
Yeah, so in some ways this relates to, I guess, what we've just discussed. Trust is most required under conditions of risk. So when there's something important at stake, there is the potential of some sort of loss or harm or adversity. And in interpersonal relationships, as well as organizational relationships, a real key source of risk and vulnerability comes from our interdependence with others, our need to rely on others, our need to depend on others. So it really comes back to that whole idea that if there's no vulnerability or risk, then trust is not as relevant. We also know that, of course, trust has this really strong reciprocal component as well. So by us willingly making ourselves vulnerable to others, by us taking risks, by us leaning in and becoming more interdependent with others, that's signaling that we're willing to trust them. And that, of course, can reciprocate trust as well.
With your co-authors Jörg Bugel and Marcus Pudelko, you wrote an article, Do Chinese Subordinates Trust Their German Supervisors? A Model of Intercultural Trust Development. The article highlights the challenges of developing trust across national cultural boundaries in an increasingly globalized work environment. Could you tell us about the cultural elements that influence the basis and forms of trust in intercultural relationships?
Understanding trust cues is a lot more complex in an intercultural relationship. This is because, of course, we don't necessarily have the same shared cultural values and norms. And there are cultural differences in the trust cues that we expect and which we rely upon. So research shows that this often leads to misunderstandings and conflicts and difficulties in establishing or maintaining trust. And our study, the paper that you referred to, is really focused on how trust develops between German supervisors and their Chinese supervisees. And what I found most interesting with this research was the very different cultural expectations and assumptions of hierarchical relationships across the German and Chinese culture. A really startling finding was that the Chinese employees came into the relationship with their supervisor with uniformly high levels of initial trust. And this high level of trust was really a form of presumptive trust, and it was based on their culturally bound, very positive role expectations of supervisors. And they expected their supervisor to be highly benevolent and caring, to invest in developing a personal relationship with them. So really wanting to get to know them as a person, their background, their family, their needs and career aspirations, and providing that sort of personalized care and guidance to them. Now, in contrast, German supervisors typically came into the relationship with a very strong task orientation, very much focused on competent performance, and often with a cultural preference to keep a strict separation between work and personal relationships. And this often came from a very positive place, a place of integrity, a desire to ensure that personal relationships don't cause conflicts of interest or favoritism and don't interfere with the work. So you can see the very clear clash of expectations coming into the relationship. And what we found was almost all Chinese supervisees experienced a loss of trust early in the relationship when they realized that their role expectations of these German supervisors were being violated. They just weren't being met. So they often became very disillusioned at this point. There was only a few Chinese supervisees who managed to avoid that. And what we noticed was that these were people who we called culturally cosmopolitan. They had had extensive experience early in their life living in foreign cultures, so they understood the cultural dynamics here. Now, some Chinese supervisees were able to restore their trust in their supervisor despite their expectations being unmet. And what was really fundamental to that was their cultural accommodation to the German culture over time. So this helped them to recognize that their supervisor's behavior was not due to a lack of care or concern for them, but rather just due to the different cultural expectations of a supervisor-supervisee kind of relationship. And the trust recovery and cultural accommodation was much more likely to occur when the Chinese supervisee was located in Germany and obviously then had more opportunity to learn and acculturate, but also when they had a trusted peer who understood both cultures and could really help them to interpret their supervisor's behavior and help recover trust. And we also found that it was helpful when the German supervisor also made some efforts to culturally accommodate to the needs of their Chinese supervisee as well. So in contrast, relationships where trust never recovered typically were with Chinese supervisees who stayed located in China. So their German supervisor was located in China too. And where they were really culturally bound around very traditional cultural values. So they weren't able to break away from that to be able to accommodate and acculturate to a new way of thinking. We're really proud of the paper, and we feel that the paper really challenges the assumption that cultural differences always result in low levels of initial trust. We showed actually you can have the opposite, but also the importance of cultural profiles and people's cultural backgrounds and experiences that played a really important role in explaining our findings.
Nicole, you were co-author of a paper by KPMG Australia called Achieving Trustworthy AI, a model for trustworthy artificial intelligence. I realize it's an older paper. It's, I think, from 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And we both know that AI developments are developing at rocket speed, but still I would like to raise the question, because the paper describes 6 elements or 6 dimensions. What is the significance of identifying those 6 elements in that model for ensuring trustworthy AI throughout the AI lifecycle?
So look, we pulled together this research report with the aim to really help organisations on this journey to want to use AI in a way that was trustworthy and responsible and would ultimately engender stakeholders' trust in the way they were using the AI. And what we find is that there's no silver bullet to achieving this. It's not like you just follow these steps and it automatically happens. You need to take a tailored approach. And the approach you take needs to be proportional to the risks, benefits, and impacts of the specific AI application that you're using. So obviously, some applications of AI have much higher risk than others do. For example, using AI for clinical diagnosis, there's a lot more potential for harm there than, for example, using AI in a recommender system where the worst that can happen is you might get shown the wrong kind of products. But what we find is that invariably achieving AI use in a trustworthy way requires an organization-wide approach. So it's not as easy as just, the tech teams will figure this out or the IT department. We really need to have a much more interdisciplinary and integrated approach. So our research identified 6 areas that need to operate in a connected way to ensure that the AI is used in a responsible way. And each of these 6 areas have a set of principles and practices that really help to manage the vulnerabilities that are associated with the use of AI. And those vulnerabilities, of course, if they're not managed well, create risk and undermine trust. So the first dimension is what we call organizational alignment. So this is essentially saying that we need to ensure that AI systems and the way they're being applied is aligned with the broader purpose of the organization, it's aligned with the organization's values, and that there's been the capability building that's required so that the right people are in place with the right capabilities, and we also have the accountability and governance mechanisms in place to really prevent harm. Data is another one of these areas, and that really is because data is the foundation to training AI systems. We need to make sure that the data is comprehensive and suitable, that it's good quality, that it has integrity, to make sure that the outcomes of the AI solutions are accurate and that they're free of unfair bias and fit for purpose. Now, we also need to, of course, ensure that the AI tool or system itself and the algorithms that are underlying that are also robust and that they're fit for purpose. So there's a whole lot of practices there around designing, developing, testing the AI to ensure that it's robust across lots of different conditions and environments and across unforeseen cases as well. So there's a lot of testing that we can do there. We also need to make sure it's auditable. So if something goes wrong, we understand where and why. And unlike traditional technology that is a bit more set and forget, this is an ongoing process that needs to occur. So there's resourcing and capabilities that need to be allocated towards that. Now, security is a really big issue. In our broader work looking at trust in AI across 17 countries, we find cybersecurity and privacy issues are the number one concern that people have around AI. So it's really important that the organization has the capability again and the know-how to protect the data and the integrity of the AI systems to be able to prevent those cyber attacks and inappropriate access and sharing of any sensitive or personal data. There's a whole legal element to this too. So the regulations and laws and even international standards around AI are developing very rapidly. There's really a very fast evolution of this. So it's really important that organisations are on the ball and aware of what their obligations are so that they're living up to regulations. And where those regulations are lagging behind the use of technology, they need to make sure that they're aligned with community expectations. And the last pillar is around ethics. So we actually find in our broader research really strong consensus, I would say actually global consensus on the principles and practices that are required for trustworthy AI, and very strong expectations that organisations using AI will uphold these. And these are really embedded within the ethical principles. So these are things like conducting impact assessments and having ethical review boards when the AI system poses significant risk. It also includes making sure that there's the proper testing to ensure that there's not discriminatory use, that the AI is actually being used to benefit people, that it's explainable, people can contest outcomes, that there's appropriate human oversight. So there's a whole lot that's in that ethical considerations there as well. This isn't something that's easy to do, but of course there's increasing good understanding of what best practice and leading practice in this space is. And I think we're getting a lot more maturity in the governance and oversight mechanisms for doing this really well. And I think the last thing I just mentioned there is that we really need to take that coordinated cross-disciplinary approach to this. It's not something that any one part of the organisation can do alone.
Nicole, as we wrap up our interview, I would like to discuss the future of trust and trust research. I always end my interviews asking my interviewee, what are the challenges for young researchers in this area?
I think some of the most exciting areas to focus on is around this big, grand challenge of our time around how do we steward emerging technologies into society in a responsible way? How do we make sure that this supports trust in our society, in our organisations and in our relationships, and doesn't actually diminish it or undermine it or result in us feeling somehow dehumanised? So we know that AI and other technologies, they're rapidly transforming how we work, how we interact, how we make decisions, how we deliver services, how we interact with services. And so while there's a lot of benefits from this, and that's why it's not going to go away, because it does drive innovation, efficiency, decision-making, access to knowledge. All of us are, not all of us, but many of us are using generative AI on almost a daily basis now. But we also need to be conscious of the fact that this is creating lots of vulnerabilities, and it is really challenging trust as well. So I think there's a huge whole program of research there trying to understand how are these technologies and digitalization more broadly changing and reconfiguring trust relationships. Just consider, for example, AI as a co-worker. How does that change our dynamics and our trust with other co-workers? How does it change how we trust ourselves and our own knowledge base? How is generative AI changing who we seek information from and who we see as experts? And how will that evolve over time? I think there's a lot of questions, of course, around what engenders trust in AI agents. What does it take for us to feel comfortable? How do we make sure that the trust we have is well calibrated, that we're not over-trusting or under-trusting? And then, of course, we've talked about the trustworthiness, which is something that I feel really passionate about, because if we can't ensure that these are trustworthy, it will lead to harm and vulnerability. And we really do have this social responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think also as these technologies are becoming more sophisticated and we're seeing deep fakes and really manipulative uses of AI, how might this even change what we consider is real and how we know what is real? So there's a lot at stake here. So I think we really need to have good research on this. I think another area is around polarization and distrust. And again, how is digitalization, and as more of us are living our lives more and more online and in these digitalized environments, how is that perhaps undermining our trust and actually leading us to become more polarized in the way that we view ourselves and identify with different communities? So I find the cancel culture in particular deeply problematic, and there's inherently a trust dynamic there. And I think we need to understand that, and it's such a rich area for future research.
So still a lot to do in the trust area. Nicole, thank you for contributing to our podcast today. I wish you good luck with your research and further work. I hope to meet you in person a little longer than we met in Helsinki. I think the next one, FINT conference, is in 2025 in Glasgow, isn't it?
That's right.
So let's aim for that. Thank you for being available.
Thank you, Severin. And I just wanted to say thank you too for this podcast series, because it's absolutely fantastic what you're doing and your passion for trust. We all really enjoy these podcasts, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.